Bail, repeat offenders, and murder. How did they go hand in hand? Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. A simple order paper question put from the Conservatives to the Trudeau Liberal government in Ottawa. How many people in each year have been out on bail or some other form of release on previous charges when they've been charged with murder, homicide in this country? Well, the numbers have come in and they will shock you. In 2022, the last year that the government provided numbers for, 256 people were charged with murder while already out on bail or some other form of release. That's up from 182 in 2019. Now, in 2022, there were only 874 murders. I say only, but the point here is almost 30% of them, more than a quarter of the murders, almost 30% of them were carried out by people out on bail. If that doesn't speak to a real problem in terms of how our system is operating, I don't know what does. The government has been under pressure on their bail reforms that were enacted in 2019, with people saying they're too soft. They've brought in some changes to them, but is it enough? Well, to talk about all of this and more, Conservative MP and critic Frank Caputo, the MP for Kamloops. Mr. Caputo, thanks for the time.
Thank you, Brian. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So let me ask you, when you see a number like 256 people charged with homicide who are out on bail or some form of release, is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, in my view, it is. It speaks to a number of problems, in my view, Brian. Number one, it obviously speaks to the problem on bail that we've been speaking about and speaking about repeatedly. I have people coming up to me, it feels like all too frequently, talking about the fact that they no longer feel safe walking down the street or that they no longer can do business. But it also speaks to the failure of the Trudeau government on the justice file as a whole. This isn't just something that we can pin on bail. I mean, this is really this statistic: 256 homicides. I just can't wrap my head around that as to how it is impacting or showing that the system as a whole is failing, and it is failing to protect people after 9 years of Justin Trudeau.
We're talking about nearly a quarter of all murders being committed by people who are out on some kind of remand. Uh, this is something that police have complained about, prosecutors have complained about, opposition politicians at the federal level, premiers of all stripes have all said there is a problem with the bail changes that the Trudeau Liberals made back in 2019. And this, to me, is a proof point of that. Would you say that it's fair when we look at, let me just pull up the numbers again here. When you go up from 182 in 2019, 198 in 2020, dropped a little bit in 2021, and then 256 in 2022. Those bail reforms from C-75 back in 2019 watered down what was there previously and made releasing people as quickly as possible with the least onerous conditions the default position, no matter what the charge was. And now we're seeing the result. Would you say that that is a proof point as a former prosecutor, as a lawyer? Is that fair for me to say?
Well, it certainly shows an alarming trend, that's for sure, when you see what a 30 or 25% increase. But people are talking to me on the streets, and these are justice practitioners as well. These aren't just people who are, coming up, that might not work in the system. They say bail is fundamentally different. And I keep track of local crime, and I could say that people who wouldn't even apply for bail 5 years ago are now getting bail routinely. The reverse onus is essentially what you're speaking of. When people are on bail and they commit another offense, they're presumed to be detained, and that just simply isn't working. And I would even take it one step further than C-75, Brian. C-75 codified some Supreme Court of Canada language. Our job as parliamentarians is to watch when the Supreme Court of Canada makes a decision on bail and to respond. This Liberal government has refused to respond. Instead of responding, they simply codified the language. We've had 3 or 4 major bail decisions that completely changed the landscape of bail, and the Liberals have sat on their hands. And then when judges apply the law, or in this case, apply what came from Bill C-75. We shouldn't be surprised by that, even though these statistics are alarming. What we need
No,
is false. Oh, go ahead.
when you say that the government should have responded, what do you mean by that? It doesn't necessarily mean invoking the notwithstanding clause. There
No.
are other ways that governments can respond to court decisions.
100%. I have Bill C-313. It's a private member's bill, and it directly relates to firearms offenders, and only the most serious firearms offenders at that. It was done in relation to the homicide where somebody was charged with first degree murder in the killing of Constable Pirjala. That is a very narrow bill that alters how we deal with serious gun offenders, people who are prohibited. That's the type of change that I'm talking about. If the current system right now, Brian, isn't targeting serious gun offenders, then we need to do that. If it's not targeting serious violent offenders, then we need to do that, because what we have right now isn't working. Even if you put all that aside, all of the statistics aside, all of the Supreme Court of Canada decisions aside, the Liberals have to know that bail is a problem, and they're doing so little about it. They had Bill C-48. On a scale of 1 to 10, it went about a 1.5. So it was a change. It was something we supported, but it went about this far as it should have gone.
I know that lawyers and former prosecutors like yourself often are reluctant to comment on judges or criticize judges, but part of this has to be the type of people, the mindset of the people that the Trudeau Liberals are appointing to the bench. They are looking for people who hold the same view as David Lametti, that, oh, look, everyone's just misunderstood, and we need to give them more chances and better chances, and that's the way things should be. I've spoken to judges and JPs who have had their rulings overturned by people appointed to the bench by the current government, applying what had been long-standing practices to sentencing or to bail conditions, and then it gets appealed, and all of a sudden you're watching somebody with very flowery language, but obviously a worldview that's at odds with keeping bad guys behind bars. That fair to say?
Well, I don't know. I haven't looked at, I haven't studied who has been appointed by the Liberal government and the levels of overturning or anything like that. Provincial court judges generally are the ones dealing with bail the most. You are right. If it is an appeal, it goes to a higher court, which are federal appointees. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be surprised if people are interpreting the laws that we give them. And the laws that we give them right now haven't said that if you are a repeat violent offender, you have to or should be staying in jail absent a problem. And bail is only part of this wider discussion on crime. The Trudeau
Oh,
government
it's
has
sentencing
been
as well, isn't it?
sentencing. It's also, if you think about it, housing, drugs. These are all things that play in. We have a system now that is in my view, looking at, when we look at hydromorphone, for instance, and the Trudeau's approach to drugs and how we're dealing with that when it comes to drug addicts, not working. Housing is an absolute mess. When we talk about even the root causes of crime, because right now when we talk about sentencing, we talk about bail, we're talking about responses, and those are incredibly important. Somebody's alleged to have committed a crime, you have to respond, right? But when we look at the whole picture and how the Trudeau government has addressed crime, an abject failure.
The rise of fentanyl in 2016 has seen a rise in all kinds of criminal activity, including guns. Fentanyl is incredibly lucrative to the criminal class, and so they turn to guns instead of knives to protect their stash, to establish territory, to take territory. But this is a government that, when it comes to gun crime, is more interested in regulating the folks at the local gun club in Kamloops than people who are actually causing harm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, if you look at one of the bills that was passed in this parliament, if somebody commits a drive-by shooting, they no longer have to go to jail. And under the Conservative government, it was 4 years or 5 years for reckless or discharge with intent. David Lametti and I actually got into a debate about this in Parliament, And he said, "Ah, somebody that, has a couple pops and takes a, shot at the broadside of a barn, are we really going to, does that person need to go to jail for 4 years?" And I'm paraphrasing what he said.
Mhm.
And I said, "Minister, this is discharge with intent. You know what that means? You're shooting at something either recklessly or with intent." The Liberals, what they'll say to you, and Minister Varani tried to pull a fast one when we were questioning him on this a couple months ago. And he said, if you do it with a prohibited or restricted firearm, you go to jail for 5 years. That's what he said. Now, what about if you don't recover the firearm? It's not like most people do a drive-by and then drop the gun and leave it. What if you know that somebody shot a gun, but you can't prove what gun they shot, which is pretty common, actually? Then it's 4 years. It was 4 years. Now that person can serve their sentence on house arrest. Extortion with a firearm, house arrest. Robbery with a firearm, house arrest. These are some of the most serious offenses. Even the courts have said if you have a handgun, you should be going to jail for 2 to 3 years. Liberals, house arrest is now available on that.
Unreal. Well, it does speak to their viewpoint. They get upset if you say it's hug a thug, and yet they continue to hug the thugs.